Vanished Operative. Operation Black Silence. The disappearance of Lieutenant James Rowen, 1984, Alaska, USA. In the winter of 1984, the Alaskan wilderness was more than just a stretch of ice and silence. It was a frozen fortress, hiding secrets colder than the snow that covered it. Lieutenant James Rowen, a disciplined, decorated U.S. Air Force officer, walked into the heart of that silence and never returned. He wasn't a rookie. He wasn't reckless. He was a man trusted with secrets above clearance, stationed at one of the most secure facilities in the country. And yet, on the morning of January 16th, he simply vanished, leaving behind a half-written report, a radio still transmitting static, and a trail of questions that no one wanted to answer. Military protocol was swift, searches deployed, statements prepared, records sealed. But as days turned into weeks, something about the official story began to crack. No footprints, no distress signal, no body, just an invisible hand sweeping away evidence, until the man himself became a ghost within his own command. Rumors spread fast inside Fort Elmendorf that Rowen had uncovered something, a mission gone wrong, or a project that was never meant to see daylight. Some said he ran. Others whispered he was taken. But those who dared to ask what Operation Black Silence really was were quickly reassigned, silenced, or disappeared from their posts altogether. Tonight, we open that sealed file. We trace the footsteps of a soldier lost, not just to the snow, but to a system built to keep the truth buried beneath it. What happened in Alaska that winter still divides experts, veterans, and families to this day. And if what was hidden in those frozen plains ever sees the light, it may change what we think we know about military power, secrecy, and loyalty. So, before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Truth. Hit the like button if you believe every story deserves to be told, and share this documentary to help us keep these unsolved files alive. Because this is not just the story of a soldier who vanished. It's the story of how silence became a weapon. The Frozen Frontier. Alaska, 1984. A land of extremes, where the sun hides for days, the cold pierces through bone, and silence itself can feel like a living thing. For Lieutenant James Rowen, the Frozen Frontier wasn't just a posting, it was isolation in uniform. Stationed at Elmendorf Air Force Base, he was part of a special operations unit tasked with monitoring Arctic communication lines, the kind of work few talked about and even fewer understood. Rowen was known for his precision, a man of order. Colleagues described him as calm under pressure, the kind of officer who could recite radio codes in his sleep. But beneath that discipline, there was a restlessness. He'd served long enough to see the Cold War's paranoia creeping into every corner of military life. And Alaska, remote and silent, was its perfect stage. That winter, the base's command structure was tense. Unmarked supply planes arrived without schedules. Classified shipments moved under armed guard at midnight. Even senior officers didn't ask questions because asking meant knowing, and knowing meant clearance you might not survive keeping. Then came Operation Black Silence, a mission so secret that even the soldiers participating didn't fully understand it. Officially, it was listed as a communication stability test. Unofficially, it was the kind of order that made men whisper instead of salute. Rowen's role seemed simple. Monitor a field relay station 60 miles north of Anchorage. But the transmission logs reveal something odd. The equipment had been malfunctioning for weeks, sending back distorted data and bursts of static, sometimes containing strange audio patterns. Engineers called it frequency bleeding. Rowen called it a signal we're not supposed to hear. In his final notebook entry, dated January 14th, 1984, he wrote, "The silence feels heavy. It hums when the wind stops. I think the frequency's alive." 2 days later, on January 16th, Rowen signed out a snow vehicle and set out for the relay post. He never came back. Search teams found the vehicle abandoned half a mile from a post. The engine was still running. Inside, his gloves were folded neatly on the passenger seat. Outside, in the snow, a single trail of footprints leading into the white and stopping mid-path as if he'd stepped into thin air. Military command classified the case immediately. They called it accidental exposure. But men who knew Rowen said otherwise. They said he found something or someone out there that the base didn't want to admit existed. The story was buried. But the silence he left behind? It's been echoing ever since classified shadows. When the news of Lieutenant Rowen's disappearance reached command, the response was immediate and strange. Within hours, the base was sealed off. Access roads were blocked by military police. Search efforts were coordinated, yes, but quietly. There were no public announcements, no alerts to local law enforcement. Officially, it was an internal matter. Unofficially, it was something they didn't want anyone to ask about. For the men who served under Rowen, this silence was louder than any alarm. He wasn't the kind to go AWOL. Not in that weather, not in those conditions. He was the kind who followed orders, even the ones that made no sense. But his fellow servicemen noticed something unsettling in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Rowen had begun to isolate himself. He skipped mess hall gatherings. He avoided the communications tent. One night, a junior officer recalled finding him staring at a frozen window for nearly an hour. When asked what he was looking at, Rowen said only, "Something's listening." After his disappearance, investigators combed through his quarters. His bunk was neatly made, his personal locker locked. But inside, they found a notebook hidden behind the insulation panel, containing notes in small, precise handwriting. One page read, "The relay posts are not for us. They're for them." Who them referred to, no one knew. The commanding officer at Elmendorf, Colonel Richard Hayes, dismissed the writings as signs of stress. But another document, one that never made it into official reports, was later leaked by a retired officer. It was a classified communication log dated January 14th, 1984, 2 days before Rowen vanished. The log showed an unauthorized transmission intercepted on the same channel Rowen was assigned to monitor. The source? Unknown. The message? 5 seconds of silence, followed by coordinates pointing deep into uncharted Arctic territory. When questioned, Hayes brushed it off as a calibration error. But those in the signal unit swore the coordinates were real and that a team was sent there quietly a week later. That team? They never filed a mission report. To this day, no record of their return exists in official archives. The military eventually listed Rowen as MIA, Arctic Training Incident. No funeral, no investigation, just another name filed under Cold War secrecy. But for those who knew him, for the families who still ask what happened, this wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. The frozen trail. 3 days after Lieutenant James Rowen's disappearance, the search had already stretched thin. Helicopters combed the permafrost. Tracking teams scanned the icy ridges north of Fort Bragg's Alaska training sector. And still, nothing. No footprints. No wreckage. No trace of the man who once prided himself on leaving none. At first, the military called it a routine cold weather accident. But beneath that official tone, whispers grew louder among the ranks. Rowen hadn't vanished on a patrol. He'd disappeared from inside the perimeter. His ID badge, radio, and personal weapon were all still in his quarters. The only thing missing was him. Then came a first break. A civilian bush pilot named Eddie Larkin reported seeing faint distress flares 2 nights after the disappearance, near a remote glacial pass 70 miles east of the base. He said they weren't standard military flares. The color was off, almost greenish-blue, pulsing erratically like a heartbeat. When Larkin radioed it in, his call was logged, but the report vanished from official records 2 days later. He tried to follow up with the Air Force liaison. The man who took the call told him, "That report never existed, Mr. Larkin. I suggest you stop asking." The next week, Larkin's plane was found abandoned at a private airstrip. His logbook was missing the last 3 pages. As the search continued, Rowen's family arrived on base. His younger sister, Margaret Rowen, and his father, a retired Navy officer. Margaret described her brother as restless during their last phone call. He told her he was finally close to proving something. When she asked what, he paused and said, "You'll know if something happens to me." Those words would haunt her for decades. Back at the base, Special Investigator Thomas Keene was brought in from Washington. Keene had handled missing personnel before, but what he found at Fort Bragg didn't make sense. Records were incomplete. Guard logs were altered. One entire night shift roster was blacked out under a classified exercise clause. When he pressed for details, an officer told him, "There's no record because there was no incident." Understand? Keene did. He'd seen that kind of order before. It meant someone up the chain wanted silence. Yet, what disturbed him most wasn't the missing paperwork. It was the terrain reports. Teams who ventured beyond the outer perimeter noted magnetic interference, sudden radio dropouts, and malfunctions in compasses, all centered near the same coordinates tied to Rowen's last transmission. That patch of ice, according to satellite readings, wasn't stable. Beneath the snow, ground-penetrating radar showed a hollow chamber, a void in the ice nearly 70 meters across. An investigator noted that it resembled a man-made tunnel, but no construction records existed for that location. When Keene submitted his findings to command, his report was quietly classified under Operation Black Silence, the very project Rowen had been working on. And that's when Keene realized he wasn't investigating a disappearance anymore. He was walking straight into a containment operation. The moment he filed his second request for access, his clearance was revoked. Within 24 hours, he was ordered back to Washington for reassignment. No explanation, no closure. Before leaving Alaska, Keene wrote one final note in his private journal. Rowen didn't vanish. He was taken, or he followed something none of us were meant to find. And deep beneath the Alaskan ice, the strange pulses continued, flickering faintly in the darkness, as if waiting for someone to notice them again. The sisters' search. It had been 2 months since Lieutenant James Rowen vanished into the Alaskan cold. For the military, the case was over. Lost in training, they said, another file buried under frost and paperwork. But for Margaret Rowen, his sister, the disappearance wasn't a closed case. It was the start of one. Margaret wasn't military. She was a civilian linguist who'd worked with satellite mapping archives at a research firm in Boston. When official channels went silent, she began tracing her brother's final communications through civilian intercept networks. That's when she found something strange. A data spike recorded by a weather satellite over the Fort Bragg Arctic perimeter on the night of January 16, 1984. The signal lasted 11 seconds, repeating every minute for nearly an hour. The frequency matched the one assigned to Rowen's personal radio band. At first, Margaret thought it was interference, a glitch. But when she enhanced the audio portion of the data, she heard something faintly beneath the static. A low rhythmic pulse, then a voice. Distorted, fractured, but unmistakably human. She isolated the pattern and slowed it down. 3 words emerged through the static. Cold, depth, origin. When she tried to share her findings with the base, her emails bounced back as restricted communication. So she did what any determined sister would do. She went there herself. Margaret arrived in Anchorage under the guise of a research journalist and drove north toward the restricted perimeter near Fort Bragg's Alaskan training site. She didn't have clearance, but she had her brother's service ID and a determination that no checkpoint could block. At a diner near the town of Talk, she met Eddie Larkin's old mechanic, who'd serviced the missing pilot's plane before it was found abandoned. He remembered something odd. Before Eddie vanished, he said he'd seen blue light under the ice. Said it wasn't natural. Said the military was out there digging where they shouldn't. He gave Margaret a small cassette, recorded from Eddie's cockpit radio the night before he disappeared. When she played it, she heard faint static at first, then a pulse, a voice buried deep in the frequency. It was the same 3 words again, only this time the final one was clearer. Cold depth origin point. Margaret's heart froze. It was the same phrase she decoded from her brother's signal. It meant James had been trying to send a message, one the military refused to acknowledge. That night, Margaret checked into a small lodge near Delta Junction. Her journal entries from that week, later recovered by a journalist, described strange phenomena. Her compass spinning on a nightstand, power outages lasting minutes at a time, and faint vibrations in the floor, as if something massive was shifting deep below. On the 7th night, she wrote, It's not just the cold. It's like the ground is alive, humming, remembering. Then, on the final page, I found the coordinates. I'm going there tomorrow. That was March 4th, 1984. The last day Margaret Rowen was seen alive. The next morning, her rented truck was found 20 miles north of the town of Talk. Door open, headlights still on. In the passenger seat was the cassette, ejected as if someone had pulled it mid-play. Her journal stopped at the last line. The signal is calling again. And just like that, another Rowen vanished into the silence of Alaska. The files that shouldn't exist. By 1994, 10 years had passed since the disappearance of Lieutenant James Rowen. The case was forgotten, sealed, classified, erased from memory. But in a quiet office in Washington, D.C., investigative journalist David Kessler stumbled across something that shouldn't have existed. He'd been digging through declassified Cold War archives for a book project about psychological warfare when he found a file labeled Operation Black Silence. Inside were just 3 pages. One was blank. One contained a blurred map of Alaska's interior. And the third, a memo stamped Top Secret, Eyes Only, with the date February 3rd, 1984. The memo read, Subject has entered restricted sector. Observation continues. Phase 2 protocol enacted, but there was no indication of who the subject was. No location coordinates. Just a redacted signature and an instruction to maintain acoustic monitoring until containment. Kessler, a former military correspondent, knew the language. Containment didn't mean recovery. It meant secrecy. Curiosity turned into obsession. He traced the few names connected to the memo and found one still living. Sergeant Alan Pierce, retired communications officer, then living quietly in Fairbanks, Alaska. Kessler flew out in December that year to meet him. He found Pierce in a small cabin outside the city, living off the grid, surrounded by maps and old radio gear. When Kessler mentioned Black Silence, Pierce froze. He turned off the radio, closed the blinds, and whispered, "You don't want to open that box." But eventually Pierce talked. He admitted that in January 1984, he'd been monitoring experimental transmission from a field relay station northeast of Fort Bragg. 2 days before Rowen disappeared, the relay began receiving bursts of unregistered frequencies that didn't match U.S. or Soviet standards. The sound was rhythmic, almost organic. When Pierce ran a spectral analysis, he saw something he still couldn't explain, a waveform that resembled a human heartbeat. It wasn't noise, Pierce said. It was something trying to communicate. Then the transmission stopped. 2 days later, Rowen was gone. After the disappearance, all base communications involving signal anomalies were classified. Pierce was reassigned, his files confiscated, and he was told never to speak of the incident again. When he refused to sign a silence agreement, he was medically discharged. Kessler asked him what the signal meant. Pierce just stared at the recorder and said, "They thought it came from under the ice." He slid a cassette across the table, a copy of an old tape he'd made before his files were taken. The label read, Black Silence, Fragment 02. When Kessler played it later that night, his hotel room trembled with static, long, low, and pulsing like a distant echo. Then, faintly, came a voice, warped but human. It said, "Origin confirmed. Depth unstable. Repeat, depth unstable." The tape ended abruptly. Kessler returned to Washington the next week, but something about the sound lingered. When he tried to digitize the recording, his computer crashed. When he replayed it through analog equipment, the signal appeared to modulate by itself, like a voice adapting to the listener. Within a month, Kessler began experiencing migraines and hearing faint static even when no devices were nearby. His colleagues thought it was stress, but his notes, recovered later by a producer, show a recurring phrase written over and over. The ice is not solid. By March 1995, David Kessler went missing. His apartment door was unlocked, his recorder still running, capturing only the faint hum of a frequency that no radio tower in the city could trace. And once again, the trail of Operation Black Silence went dark. Signals in the ice. By the early 2000s, Alaska had changed, but the mysteries buried in its frozen expanse had not. Lieutenant James Rowen's disappearance had long been classified. Margaret Rowen had vanished without a trace years earlier. Even investigative journalist David Kessler had disappeared under strange circumstances. Yet, deep in the archives of a small private research lab in Fairbanks, a signal was waiting to be heard again. Enter Dr. Naomi Clark, a geophysicist specializing in Arctic acoustic anomalies. She had been analyzing satellite data for anomalies in remote regions when she came across faint pulsations emanating from the coordinates associated with Rowen's last transmission. At first, she thought it was equipment interference. But after weeks of monitoring, the pattern became unmistakable. The pulse wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost human. When Clark played back the recordings, she noticed something chilling. Embedded within the pulse were fragments of voice-like signals. Not just random sounds, but words. Fragmented, distorted, unrecognizable, yet unmistakably intentional. She traced the signal back to a remote glacial shelf, a site previously unmarked on any military or civilian map. The ice there was unusually thick, deeper than any natural glacier should have been. Clark reached out to retired personnel who had worked at Fort Bragg during Rowen's disappearance. Most refused to speak, but one former radar technician living in Anchorage under a pseudonym finally agreed to meet. "I saw him," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "James." He went into the ice. It wasn't voluntary. Something called to him. He produced a faded photograph taken at the relay post the night Rowen vanished. In it, a blurry figure could be seen moving across the snow, alone, yet accompanied by faint streaks of light that seemed to hover in the air. Clark's research revealed that the pulsing signal had been continuous since 1984. Every so often, it intensified, and recordings picked up variations in frequency that suggested movement, as if something under the ice was responding to whoever was listening. She theorized that the so-called Black Silence wasn't merely a failed military operation. It was a containment effort, not to protect secrets on paper, but to contain something alive under the ice. Clark published her initial findings in an obscure Arctic science journal. The article barely made the news, but it caught the attention of one man, Mark Reynolds, a retired intelligence officer familiar with Operation Black Silence. Reynolds warned her, "You're poking at a wound that doesn't want to heal. Whatever's there, it's patient, and it's been waiting for decades." That night, Clark reviewed her recordings once more. The heartbeat-like pulse grew stronger, forming a rhythm that seemed almost conversational. She slowed it down and isolated the fragments. And then she heard it clearly, a voice repeating a single phrase over and over. "Origin point, origin point, origin point." The next morning, Clark's lab experienced a complete electrical shutdown. Cameras, computers, and recording equipment all failed. When power returned, the pulse recordings had been partially erased, distorted beyond recognition. And so, Operation Black Silence had resumed, silently and unseen, decades after Rowen vanished. For Clark, one truth became horrifyingly clear. The ice held the answers, and those answers were still calling. Chasing the pulse. The signal had waited for decades, and now it had been heard. Dr. Naomi Clark wasn't alone in her pursuit anymore. Retired intelligence officer Mark Reynolds and private investigator Ethan Cole joined her, drawn together by overlapping mysteries. Lieutenant Rowen's disappearance, Margaret Rowen's vanishing, and the strange events surrounding investigative journalist David Kessler. Together, the team reviewed old reports, satellite data, and military logs. A pattern began to emerge. Each disappearance corresponded with pulses emitted from specific, unmarked coordinates deep in Alaska. And each pulse increased in intensity over time, as if whatever was under the ice was tracking them. Their first expedition took them to the last confirmed location of Rowen's snow vehicle, an area untouched by any official search teams. Clark's equipment immediately picked up irregular readings. Magnetic compasses spun wildly, radios emitted faint, unintelligible whispers, and thermal sensors detected a subtle, unnatural warmth beneath the frozen surface. Ethan Cole noted, "It's like the ice itself is breathing, and waiting for someone to respond. They followed the signal along a ridge leading to a glacial crevice. Inside, the ice seemed to hum, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Clark adjusted her instruments, translating the pulse into audible frequencies. Then they heard it, a voice fragmented but distinct. Origin, depth, awake. Reynolds froze. It's repeating Rowen's last words. Suddenly, a portion of the ice wall near the crevice shimmered. A faint blue light glowed beneath, pulsating in time with the signal. For a brief moment, the team swore they saw a shadow move beneath the ice, humanoid, yet distorted, as if someone was walking in water beneath solid ice. Ethan shined his thermal scope, but the heat signature disappeared. Nothing remained except the pulse, continuing its relentless rhythm. As the team set up a temporary camp, Clark examined the frequency on a portable laptop. Each signal seemed tied not only to location, but to time intervals corresponding with previous disappearances. It was as if the ice itself kept a record, and Rowen, Margaret, Kessler, and possibly others had triggered it. Night fell, and the temperature dropped sharply. Clark heard a faint whisper behind her, a voice carrying across the snow, though no one was near. Origin, follow. Mark Reynolds whispered. We're not just tracking them. They're tracking us. The team realized that their expedition had activated something. The pulse was no longer passive. It was responsive. By dawn, strange formations appeared in the snow around their camp. Footprints that led away from the crevice and then abruptly vanished. Cole noted, the ice is creating pathways or illusions. Something is testing us. Despite fear, the team pressed on. Every piece of evidence, the pulse, the hidden tunnels, the vanished individuals, pointed to one chilling possibility. Operation Black Silence was not a failed mission. It was an ongoing containment, and the entity, or phenomenon, beneath the ice was patient, intelligent, and aware of anyone approaching.